So we come now to Hezekiah in Isaiah as a pattern for Christ, and we're going to have a look at the keys of the kingdom being revealed. Now this is where we're going to go back to Christ's first advent. We've been talking about his second advent, and we're going to go back to that theme in our next study. We just want to step back in history to what Isaiah has to say in relation to Hezekiah that gave our Lord Jesus Christ an insight into what was awaiting him. And there's a lot to be seen in this, and he had a very great appreciation of where Hezekiah stood in the scheme of things. So we're going to take up that theme, and we're going to see the patterns that were set down for Christ and the keys of the kingdom, which were so much part of his life, revealed here in the story of Hezekiah. So we're in this area here still. We haven't moved too far forward, and we're sort of staying in this area at the end of the history of Israel and the reign of Hezekiah. So who is this Hezekiah? Well, one of the most likeable and successful kings of all of Judah's history. We call him Yahweh's trusting servant. His name means strengthened of Yah. He reigns for 29 years. 15 of that, of course, was by divine grace, wasn't it? It was his 14th year when he was attacked by the Assyrians and fell sick, grievously sick, would have died, but was given the extension of life for 15 years. He dies, of course, at age 54, which means that in terms of probation he wasn't given all that long, but I'd be happy. Quite frankly, I would be perfectly happy with that kind of outcome, and I'm sure we all would be happy to be a little bit like Hezekiah. His mother's name was Abijah. Yah is his father. He couldn't look, could he, to his father Ahaz, that's for sure. And he wasn't looking to Ahaz. Truly, Yahweh was his father, and so his mother's name, and obviously she plays a very important part in Hezekiah's development. So let's just have a look at his character. Let's just stand back and have a look at Hezekiah's character. He was the greatest king of Judah and Israel since David 270 years earlier. Now we can say that because Asa's reformation was the greatest reformation in Judah's history, but Asa himself collapsed at the end, lost his faith. It didn't happen to Hezekiah. He was chosen by God as a type of Christ, as we're going to see. He was noted for outstanding trust in Yahweh. And you know the record, it says that there was no one like him who trusted in Yahweh with all his heart. He had that confidence, which of course is the complete antithesis of his father. Ahaz had not a skerrick of faith in Yahweh. He did not trust in him at all. Didn't even believe in him. Hezekiah was the complete antithesis of his father. So how did that come about? Well, it didn't come about from Ahaz's example or instruction, did it? It came about because doubtless his mother intervened in some way and developed him as a child. He had this positive approach to opening the doors of the ecclesia, of the house of God, to all who would enter upon the basis of faith and truth. Very first thing he did. He was the mover of the greatest reformation in Judah since the times of King Asa. And he was the restorer of the priesthood, of the temple and of its services. And of course there's a lot of time devoted in the record, isn't there, to Hezekiah's reformation and the holding of his Passover. A lot of time devoted to that in the record. But I think perhaps the most important references about this man are here. There's two of them. 2 Chronicles 31. So let's start in 2 Chronicles 31. Right at the end of the chapter, in verse 20, we read this about Hezekiah. And thus did Hezekiah throughout all Judah, and wrought that which was good and right and truth before Yahweh his God. The word right there, yashar, means to be straight. And he was a straight man, a man of integrity. The word truth, of course, is well known to you. It's the word emeth. It's that word which Yahweh chooses in Exodus 34 verse 6 to refer to that portion of his character. And the word emeth means it's not so much about truth, although that's, of course, its ultimate sense. It's actually about stability, certainty, and trustworthiness. And of course, it's the characteristic that Yahweh wants to see in us. He wants to see that stability and trustworthiness. People who have absolute confidence in him, who want to be like him, firm and stable and sure. People of integrity, that you can be confident. You know how they're going to behave. People of integrity. What does Yahweh require of thee? But to what? Yeah. To do, what's the first one? To do justly. Yeah, that's the characteristic. And then to love mercy. And to walk humbly with your God. So this is a very, very important characteristic, isn't it? That is highlighted here in the life of Hezekiah. But there's another reference in 2 Chronicles 32 and verse 32, the next chapter, which adds to that. And that reads, now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and his goodness, that's all I want. Because the word goodness there is chesed. This is the word used in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, of the character declared to Moses, the character of God declared to Moses. So when you look at Hezekiah, he has got both aspects of the divine character. Two separate references, but the composite character of the Father. He has got that stability, that truthfulness, that loyalty, that faithfulness, but he also has that aspect of mercy and loving kindness. And you know the word chesed has the idea of leaning down to support or help an inferior. So here is that loving kindness that is, of course, the characteristic of our God, which was seen and displayed in the life of Hezekiah. So he's a wonderful example to follow. So that's all I'm going to say really about, I mean, you could spend this whole School of Prophets on Hezekiah. We just had a kids camp last year on Hezekiah. I mean, it was impossible in a week. It was impossible to get through it all. There's that much on Hezekiah. So we have to be brief. What we want to do is have a look at Hezekiah in relation to our Lord Jesus Christ. That's where we want to aim now. So here's a harmony of the records of the life of Hezekiah. There's something unique about this. It's the only one. He's the only king, apart from Ahaz, he's the only king of whom we have a historical account. Ahaz is not really a historical account. Hezekiah really is the only one who has a third historical account that's almost identical to Kings and Chronicles. Now you see these columns here? So we have, this is the list of what happens in his life. 2 Chronicles 29 begins the story and runs down 31. 2 Kings begins the story in chapter 18 and runs down here. There are certain things you read in Chronicles that you don't read in Kings. So over here you have a historical record in Isaiah. It begins in chapter 14. You're going to see it fills out in chapters 36 to 39. So none of the early history of Hezekiah appears in Isaiah. We have to ask, well, why not? Well, there's going to be a reason for that. But there's a uniqueness about this man. Why do we have, right in the middle of the prophecy of Isaiah, 4 chapters, 36, 37, 38 and 39, which repeat much of the history that you read in Kings and Chronicles? Why? So we're going to explore the reason for that. And why the repetition of the Assyrian invasion and Hezekiah's sickness in Isaiah? Why is that emphasised in the historical account of Isaiah? Well, It is not only chapters 36 to 39 where the Assyrian invasion is at the forefront in the prophecy of Isaiah. It's all over. See here? This is a list. This is a list of what happened in the days of Hezekiah when the Assyrian invaded. It starts at chapter 10. It goes through chapter 20, 22 to 36. And then again here in 36. So there's very much emphasis in the historical account in Isaiah of Hezekiah's life on the Assyrian invasion and on his sickness unto death. Isaiah, in fact, records one item that does not appear in the Kings or the Chronicles. And again, you have to ask, why? So what is it? Is that one you can see there with the red line around it? It's chapter 38, verses 9 to 22 of Isaiah, where you have the record of Hezekiah's recovery and his psalm of praise. You don't read about that, Kings or Chronicles, but you do read about it in Isaiah. So, when you're looking at the scriptures, and this is one of the essential things. If we take nothing else away from the school of the prophet, you know what it is we have to take away? Become our own personal Bible student. What you've got to take away is the need for careful reading. And if you read the Bible carefully and you ask questions, why does it say it like that? Why is this repeated over and over again? Why is that left out? Why don't these records tie up? That's the sort of questions you've got to ask yourself and go looking for answers. You put enough work and enough effort and time into it, ask for God's help, He's going to reveal it to you. It'll open up. This is what kings do, isn't it? It is the honour of kings to search out a matter. We're not just cursory readers. We are students. And this is the kind of thing that you notice when you carefully consider the scriptures. Why is this in here and not in Chronicles and Kings? Well, we want to explore that. So this is the history. The Assyrians invade the land of Judah in the days of Hezekiah. We have that record in 2 Chronicles 32 verse 1, after these things and the establishment thereof, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered into Judah and encamped against the fenced cities and thought to win them for himself. And of course we know what happens. He sends Rabshakeh with an ultimatum. And Rabshakeh, which he means the chief butler because he's going to dispense the wine of Babylon, so to speak. Alright, he's going to hand out the wine. Delivered these intoxicating words, making promises that were not going to be fulfilled. He stood upon the Virgin's fountain with the waters of Shiloah beneath his feet. You know how that Hezekiah, he built the tunnel and he channeled the waters of the spring Gihon. And he covered it over. He covered the spring because it was outside the walls. He covered it over so that the Assyrians wouldn't come and find water. You need water for an army, see? So he channels this water into the city. But when Rabshakeh is standing there, he doesn't know that the waters of Shiloah or Siloam are flowing under his feet. And of course Isaiah chapter 8 makes a lot of that, and so does Christ in John chapter 9, by the way, but we won't digress. So here he is. He's met by contrasting men. There's Shebna, the faithless. This is the man who in Isaiah 22 is, while he's negotiating with Rabshakeh, has men digging his grave. They are preparing a tomb for Shebna. And you can go there today and there's a plaque on the, tomb of Shebna. It's down, somewhere down in the valley of the Kidron. So he's got men digging his grave. And of course there's the other man, Eliakim, who of course is a type of Christ in Isaiah 22. He's the faithful man. So there's two contrasting men who've got their heads sticking over the wall negotiating with Rabshakeh. Now Rabshakeh makes false claims, doesn't he? He makes the claim that Hezekiah and Judah was relying on Egypt. That was because there was an Egypt party in Judah. There were people saying, we need to get the help of Pharaoh against these Assyrians. He makes the claim that Hezekiah had removed very important religious icons. Well, he had. He'd taken away the idols of Ahaz and others. Yeah, he'd removed icons, but they weren't They weren't the right icons, were they? So there was a false claim. And he made the claim that Sennacherib had been sent by God. Well, that wasn't true either, although God was to use the Assyrians for his purpose. And so you look at the record of 2 Kings, and I think maybe we should come to 2 Kings chapter 18, which is what I've been referring to. And you read verse 23. He ridicules the strength of the defenders. Now therefore I pray thee, give pledges, he says, to my lord the king of Assyria, and I will deliver to thee 2,000 horses if you can find men to ride them. He's ridiculing the strength of the men of Judah. In verses 31 to 32, he makes this false promise of tranquility, that every man will live under his vine and under his fig tree. I'll take you away to a land that is flowing with milk and honey, so to speak. It's all false. Now, this would be great, wouldn't it? It would be great if the whole nation could withstand that because they had the faith and the trust of Hezekiah. But they didn't. And that's the sad part about it. I want you to have a look at the state of the nation at this time. We need to go to Isaiah 22. Because here we have the spiritual state of Judah at the time of the invasion of the Assyrian. Isaiah 22 verse 1 says, the burden of the valley of vision, it's the vision of peace of course, but it wasn't a time of peace. What aileth thee now, that thou art wholly gone up to the housetops? Thou art full of stirs, a tumultuous city, a joyous city. My slain men are not slain with the sword, nor dead in battle. But they were dead. He says, thy slain men, they're not slain with the sword, but they're dead. Yeah, they were dead in heart, because they thought they were going to die. If you have a look at verse 12 and 13 of the same chapter, you read this. And in that day did Adonai Yahweh of hosts call to weeping, and to mourning, and to baldness, to girding with sackcloth. And behold, this is what happened. Joy and gladness, slaying oxen and killing sheep, eating flesh and drinking wine. Why were they doing this? Because they thought they were dying. They were going to die. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. And let's get as much down the gullet as we can before they get a head cut off. That was the attitude of many people in the city of Jerusalem. And they were in turmoil of mind. They were dead in heart and hope, out of sheer dread of what faced them. Preparations had been made. Hezekiah built the tunnel, he strengthened the walls, etc., as we're told. And in verses 12 to 14, which we've just read, the spirit that animated that people was panic and hopelessness, resignation and foreboding of doom. Hence that policy, eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So the two major classes in the nation were actually encapsulated in two men. There's the Shebna. Look at Shebna of chapter 22 verses 15 to 19. Don't have time to read that whole passage, but let's just read verse 16. So God tells the prophet, go get thee unto this treasurer. Now he's not a treasurer. The Hebrew word in verse 15, treasurer, actually means a companion. He was the king's friend, like the one of 1 Kings 4 verse 5. He's a king's friend. So he's close to the king. Go to Shebna, which is over the house, and say, what hast thou here? And whom hast thou here? That thou hast hewed thee out a sepulchre here, as he that heweth him out a sepulchre on high, and that graveth an habitation for himself in a rock. And he's told that he's not going to be laid in the sepulchre. He's going to go to Babylon, captivity. Okay, so this is a prophecy about a man who is actually a microcosm of portion of the nation in the days of Hezekiah. But there's another man, verse 20. It shall come to pass in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim. His name means Ale shall set up, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with thy robe and strengthen him with thy girdle. I will commit thy government into his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Look at these words. And the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, so he shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open. And I will fasten him as a nail in a sure place, and he shall be not for a glorious throne to his father's house, but as it should read, he shall be for a throne of glory to his father's house. Well, that's obvious who that's referring to, isn't it? He's set forth as a type of the Lord Jesus Christ, who quotes those very words of verse 22 to the Philadelphian ecclesia in Revelation chapter 3. So you know that this is a type of Christ. So we've got a crisis, haven't we? There's a real crisis. Now, the Assyrian invasion is crisis enough. Come back to the record of 2 Kings chapter 19. So while Shebna is a type of those who had no faith, Eliakim is a type of those like Hezekiah who had faith and confidence in Yahweh. In the record of 2 Kings 19, we read what happens when Rabshakeh's report is given to Hezekiah. It came to pass when the king Hezekiah heard it that he rent his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of Yahweh. And he sent who? He sent Eliakim, which was over the household, and Shebna the scribe and the elders of the priests, covered with sackcloth, to Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos. So there's mourning. This is why this sackcloth is put on. It's worn to signify distress. It's a self-imposed affliction. And so he sends to Isaiah, whose name means Yah is salvation, who's the son of Amos, strong. So the appearance of Isaiah is very significant. Along comes Eliakim and Shebna, who were to be the subject of the far-reaching prophecy we've just looked at in Isaiah 22, but not before Hezekiah himself had been the suffering servant of Yahweh, setting forth the type of the suffering servant of Yahweh. And that's what Hezekiah is going to become in this incident that occurs. Now, we're not going to go into all the details of it. We are just going to run you through very quickly. 2 Kings 19 verse 3, they report the trouble. There's a day of trouble or tightness. They're confined in. Because what happened was that when the Assyrians came into the land, they took 46 cities of Judah, 46 major cities of Judah. There's only 3 major cities left standing here. That's Jerusalem, Libnah and Lachish. So they're in serious trouble. They are being locked in, confined in. It's a time of rebuke or chastisement or reproof. It is an enormous crisis in the life of Hezekiah and his people. They've never been tested like this before. It's also a time of blasphemy, he says. Blasphemy against the divine name. And that, of course, is the secret, isn't it, to their salvation. Because when Rabshakeh, on behalf of Sennacherib, opened his mouth and said, "There's no God that's been able to save their people out of the hand of Sennacherib, my Lord. What about your God?" Signed his own death warrant. That was the end of the story. It was blasphemy against the Most High. And you know, in verse 3, there's an interesting little phrase there. This is what Hezekiah tells his messengers to say to Isaiah. The end of verse 3. "For the children are come to the birth, and there is not strength to bring forth." He didn't have a child. He did not have a child. He did not have a successor to the line of David. And that was a problem. It was going to be a real problem. When he fell sick in the midst of this crisis, he mentions reproach in verse 4, that his master has sent Rabshakeh to reproach the living God. And blasphemy and reproach against Yahweh was to Hezekiah the most important issue here. It was to be the means of their deliverance. He calls Yahweh the living God. He really believed in him. Ahaz, his father, did not. But it was while he was under this intense pressure, of course, that it gets worse. And he calls upon God to reprove Sennacherib and Rabshakeh for their blasphemous words. In verse 6, this is the response that comes back from Yahweh through Isaiah. And Isaiah said unto them, Thus shall ye say to your master, Thus saith Yahweh, Be not afraid of the words which thou hast heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumour, and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. And of course that's what happens. You remember the incident when the 185,000 perished overnight, and Sennacherib returned to his own land? That's what happened. You know how long it was afterwards? 20 years. 20 years before Sennacherib was killed by his own sons. Seems like a long time, doesn't it? Not in God's economy. It was sure and certain, but it didn't happen until 20 years later. So Isaiah's encouraging reply in verse 7 is something that Hezekiah can lean upon. As Rotherham translates it, Behold me, about to let go against him a blast. Yahweh destroys, as we read in the prophecy of Isaiah, he destroys with the breath of his mouth. And he's going to do that to the latter day Assyrian, we read in Isaiah 30, verses 27 to 31. He will hear a rumour. There'll be an announcement. And of course we know that the king of the north is going to be led by a rumour, by tidings out of the east and the north when he's in Egypt, remember that? And I'll cause him to fall. Yep, and he was going to fall by providential intervention. But this is the next chapter. This is 2 Kings 20. So we've got this crisis. Now, it'd be bad enough, wouldn't it? It'd be bad enough to be in that situation, but then you're struck down with sickness. If you've ever had any sort of real bad sickness, you know how debilitating that is mentally. So, you know, this man is being put under enormous pressure. So it says in chapter 20, verse 1, in those days, Hezekiah was sick unto death. And the prophet Isaiah, of course, is sent into him to tell him to set his house in order because he's going to die. But it became very clear to Hezekiah that this was a disaster of unparalleled proportions because he had no successor. So why didn't he have a son? Why wasn't this king married at age 39? He came to the throne at 25. He reigned for 14 years and the Assyrians came along. He was 39 years of age. He's a king. Why isn't he married? Because he wasn't married. He had no children. Well, there's got to be reasons for this, doesn't there? And we're going to explore that. Thou shalt not live, says the prophet Isaiah. You will not recover. So we don't know what the disease was of verse 7. As Isaiah said, take a lump of figs and they took it, laid it on the boil and he recovered. There's a lot of opinions about that. You know, elephantiasis and leprosy. And it was related to leprosy, as you're going to see. Some kind of boil related to leprosy was evident. And he makes an appeal. This I think is one of the most marvellous little pieces in the record of Hezekiah's life. That he's told firmly that he's going to die. And then we read this in verse 2. That he turned his face to the wall and prayed unto Yahweh, saying, I beseech thee, O Yahweh, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. Could you say that? If you're in a crisis like this, could you say that? Look at my record. Now this is not pride, is it? It's just a statement of fact. Look at my record. I have served with a perfect heart. Could God deny the truth of that? No. So you see, he could say with confidence, weeping, that he had served his God with all his heart. He was totally confident in that. And he's right. He's quite right. So this cry of anguish, he asked God to remember him like Nehemiah. Prayed often, didn't he, in Nehemiah? Remember me for good. Yeah, there was always going to be bad, but it had to be forgiven. But remember me for good. We need to be able to say that. We need to have some kind of record. There will be sins, but they can be acknowledged, repented of, and forgiven. And they'll be kept out of the record. You know what's not going to be washed out of the record? would not be erased from the record. It's the good. Remember me for good. He had served God in truth. We read about that earlier. It was true. He had what's called a perfect heart. You know what that means now, don't you? This is a heart that would not turn away to other gods. He would never turn away to other gods. And he wept sore, like Jacob did. He wept bitterly, or aloud, with a great weeping, as the original has it. And so Isaiah was turned around in the outer court, in the middle court. He didn't get halfway across the court and Yahweh says, then turn around and go back. What a God. What a God we serve. And we have good reason to have confidence in him like Hezekiah did. And so he says, verse 5 of 2 Kings 20, turn again and tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people. He's the captain of their salvation. The captain of my people. I've heard thy prayer. I've seen thy tears. Behold, I will heal thee. Look at the day. On the third day. Yeah, we know what that's about. On the third day. So Hezekiah's healing is clearly a typical resurrection on the third day, pointing to the greater suffering servant of Yahweh. So we know that Hezekiah is a type. They took this lump of figs, a cake of figs, upon the boil, this burning inflammation, this ulcer, and then he's given a sign, isn't he? He's given a sign, 2 Kings 20 and verse 8. What shall be the sign? And the sign is in the sundial of Ahaz, of all people, the faithless man who would not seek a sign from Yahweh. He gets a sign in the sundial of Ahaz. And that sign, of course, is the sign of the degrees, verse 9. And Isaiah said, this sign shall thou have of Yahweh. He will do the thing that he has spoken. Shall a shadow go forward 10 degrees or back 10 degrees? Now this word degrees, mala, of course, simply means an elevation, a step or a grade mark, sort of going up like an echelon. But this is the word that is used of the songs of degrees. So how many years is he given? 15. How many songs of degrees are there? 15. Yeah. And they were compiled by Hezekiah, one for each year of the extension of his life. So a very brief word, and it has to be brief, about the songs of degrees. And many of you, of course, are wholly familiar with the songs of degrees. I don't need to tell you anything about it. But we will mention briefly about the songs of degrees. They're structured into 5 groups of 3. 5's the number of grace. 3's the number of fruit, result, outcomes. Okay? The first of each of those groups is about distress. The second is about trust in Yahweh. And the third is about blessing and peace in Zion. So you've got these 5 groups of 3. 10 of those psalms are by Hezekiah. 4 are by David. And 1 by Solomon. Now Solomon is the one in the middle. That's Psalm 127. There are 7 on either side of Solomon's psalm. 5 of those 7 on either side are by Hezekiah and 2 by David. So you can see there's a structure here, isn't there? As there is in all scripture, there's a structure. In each of the 7, Yahweh occurs 24 times. 24 is the number of priesthood. Once in the third of each 7. So there's unquestionably a structure there. And 3 in Psalm 127. Now, you can look at the background, you'll see why this is all there. But that's the songs of degrees. It's incredible. And this comes out of his sickness and his healing. This extension of life for 15 years. In the sundial of 8. It's a light thing for the sun to go down 10 degrees because, the sun's going down anyway, isn't it? But what about going back 10 degrees? That's a miracle. It's a miracle. And so here in the sundial of the faithless Ahaz, and that's the sort of sundial they used to have in those days. They had this concave thing and a little pointer out from the top of it. Can you see the pointer there? This little pointer out of the top, and it's casting a little shadow. And they had the hours, right? And you got it's a good approximation of the time of the day. So he knew, he's watching this. He's got a man watching this. It's going back. It goes back 10 degrees in the sundial of Ahaz the faithless. So when he's healed, he writes a song, his recovery and song of praise. Hezekiah is portrayed as the suffering servant of Yahweh. He is raised after 3 days. He marries Hephzibah, my delight is in her. He bears the seed to declare his generation. You can sort of feel for the language I'm using here. This is Isaiah 53. So you compare this psalm, which we have recorded in Isaiah 38, with the language of Isaiah 53, and you'll find some very real comparisons. So let's do this. Let's go to Isaiah 38. Whereon being cured, verse 9, we read the writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, when he had been sick and was recovered of his sickness. Here's the song. I said in the cutting off of my days. The word means noontide. So what we have here is Hezekiah's thoughts during the bleak days of his sickness. He goes on to say this in verse 10. I shall go, he says, to the gates of Sheol, the grave. I am deprived of the residue of my years. I said, I shall not see Yahweh in the land of the living. He's talking about real life. And I shall behold man no more with the inhabitants of the world. In verse 12, he says, mine age is departed. In other words, his time is up. But the RSV puts it, my dwelling is plucked up and removed from me. Goes on to say, he's like a shepherd's tent. They used to put up a little flimsy tent, a suck-off, a booth, and then they shifted it somewhere else, easily, quickly dismantled. He talks about pining sickness in that verse 12. From the loom doth he cut me off, say the other translations. In verse 13 he says, I reckoned till the morning, that as a lion so will he break all my bones. So he's crying out for help right through the night until the morning. Undertake for me, he says in verse 14. In other words, be thou my security. And in verse 15 he says, what shall I say? He hath both spoken unto me and himself hath done it. I shall go softly all my years in the bitterness of my soul. As the RSV puts it, all my sleep has fled because of the bitterness of my soul. And in verse 17 he says, behold, for peace I had great bitterness, but thou hast in love to my soul delivered it from the pit of corruption. For thou hast cast all my sins behind my back. So here's what God had done for him. He had raised him from the dead. Virtually raised him from the dead. Now Yahweh did that because it's all foreshadowing the work of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so in chapter 38 and verse 19, he looks to the deliverance, the final deliverance of Zion, or deliverance in Zion. He says in verse 19, look at this language. The living, he shall praise thee as I do this day. The father to the children shall make known thy truth. He had no children, but the extension of 15 years was going to give him the opportunity to have a family. And so verse 21 makes reference to that lump of figs, the plaster which they put on the boil. 2 Kings 19 verse 35 tells us that in that night Sennacherib's army had returned to lay siege against Jerusalem, but even before the preparations were made, disaster struck on their first night, and the 185,000 were destroyed. And when they arose, it says, when men arose, they were all dead corpses outside the wall. So Hezekiah is resurrected, and the Syrian army is decimated, it's destroyed. You've got this wonderful contrast. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that Hezekiah is even a more marvellous type of Christ than first meets the eye. When his father put him on the hands of Molech, he was severely burnt. We're going to see the language that is used of Christ, which actually is based upon Hezekiah. But firstly, I want to have a look at the keys of the kingdom. Because in this psalm that we've just read in Isaiah 38, we have one of the references that Christ makes to the keys of the kingdom. Now we know that this is, I want you to have a look at Matthew 16. Come to Matthew 16, and you might just want to pop something in Isaiah 38. Come to Matthew chapter 16, to the preparation for the transfiguration. Now, you're familiar with this record, so we don't need to spend time going through it all. Come down to verse 16. This is the declaration that Peter makes. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. This is the platform upon which the ecclesia is to be built. So Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, the hearing son of the dove, the hearing son of the Spirit, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say unto thee, you're still a movable stone, a Petros. I'm actually paraphrasing for you. You're still a movable stone, but upon this Petra, this immovable rock, you're movable, but not this rock. Upon your statement, which is the immovable bit, all right, that I am the Christ, the anointed, the Son of the living God, I will build my ecclesia. All right, well, you know that pretty well, don't you? But look what he says then. He says, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's straight from Isaiah 38 and verse 10. We read that passage, didn't we? Isaiah 38 verse 10, he said, in the cutting off of my days, I shall go to the gates of Sheol. It's the word Hades in the Greek. It's the same. It's the equivalent of Sheol in the Hebrew. It's the grave. But the gates of the grave shall not prevail against it. This is one of the keys of the kingdom. It's about the sufferings of Christ. All right? The fact that he would enter the grave, but it's not going to hold him. Now, Peter was given these two keys, and we know what they are. They're identified in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 11 appropriately. They're the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow. And they're mentioned together at least 7 times in the first of Peter. We might note them a bit later. Peter used both keys twice. He used them to the Jews in Acts 2, where his subject is the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. He used them again in Acts chapter 10 in the house of Cornelius, where the same speech, well, a similar speech is given about the sufferings of Christ and the glory that follow. So when we read about the gates of hell here, that's directly drawn from the language of Hezekiah in Isaiah 38:10. But what about the keys that are referred to in verse 19 of Matthew 16? And I'll give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Well, that's Isaiah 22 and verse 22. That's the language we read about Eliakim, remember? Eliakim, the type of Christ, who would be a throne of glory for the house of his father. They would hang upon him the government. He's got the keys of the house of David, which he makes reference to a couple of times in the Apocalypse. Okay? This is about Christ. So you've got Christ drawing the 2 keys of the kingdom from the history of Hezekiah. So we know where he stands in the scheme of things. It's very, very clear, isn't it? Well, what do keys do? Well, keys provide access, but only if used in the correct manner. Whatsoever thou mayest bind upon earth shall, having been bound in the heavens, says the Young's literal translation. In other words, not like the Catholics who think they got the keys and they can do what they like. Right? This is You operate the key on the basis of the divine principles. What's bound in heaven is what you do on earth. And of course, these two keys are the sufferings and the glory. If you look through, I'm not going to go through this. I mean, most of you are familiar with this. If you look through Matthew 16, you'll see that you've got these two keys. Verse 21, the Son of Man must suffer many things, but be raised again. Suffering, glory. Lose life, find life. Take up the cross, reward. Rebuke, get thee behind me, Satan. You'll see the Son of Man in the kingdom. See? Suffering, glory. And it's all through that context. And the principle is clear. The cross must come before the crown, the suffering before the glory. So Peter's declaration was to become the foundation of Christ's ecclesia. The sufferings, as we saw in that little section at the end of the chapter, must precede the glory. And you can go to Psalm 22 and you find exactly the same structure. The keys of the kingdom are in Psalm 22. Little wonder then that Peter's first epistle is full of these keys. And if you haven't done this exercise, if you haven't worked through the first of Peter and highlighted in the colour the sufferings, I got red because that's blood, all right, sufferings, and the glory, green or blue, whatever you want, green is immortality, right, you need to do it. You need to do that little exercise because it's clear that he's basing his whole epistle on those two keys of the kingdom. He says this in verse 1 of his first chapter. He says, searching what? Or what manner of time the Spirit of Christ which was in them did signify. When it testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ, that's key 1, and the glory that should follow, key 2. And Psalm 22, as I said, is all about that subject. They're not David's words because he experienced nothing like Psalm 22 in his life. The two parts of Psalm 22 reveal the two keys of the kingdom. From verse 1 to 21a, first half of the verse, deal with the sufferings of Christ in great detail, incredible detail about crucifixion. And the second part, from 21b to 31, treats of the glory that would follow. Okay, and you can look at the citation of Psalm 22, verse 22, in Hebrews 2:12, which talks about the captain of our salvation and so on, in the context of the sufferings of Christ and the glory that would follow. And of course we know that Psalm 22 is actually based on Genesis 22, when Abraham takes Isaac to a hill in the land of Moriah and sets forth the type of Yahweh and his son in that place. Look, I'm not going to go through that now. We want lunch, don't we? Yeah, we do. I haven't been talking all that long. But anyway, we want lunch. You can get this information. And if you haven't done this little exercise, I'm not going to work you through it now. There's the list of where the keys of the kingdom are mentioned in the first of Peter. I can't leave this up for too long. But as I said, Peter uses these twice, to the Jews in Acts 2 and to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10. We're going to leave his visage was marred more than any man a bit later. Okay. We're going to see just how powerful the type of Hezekiah is. How wonderful it was for our Lord Jesus Christ to see in Hezekiah a suffering servant of Yahweh who prefigured all of the sufferings that he would go through, but then would be raised again on the third day.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section, where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service, where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch, and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter, which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.